you see me okay if I stand behind this podium? Okay, all right, good. Well, welcome everyone to this year's AWP conference in Los Angeles. It's great to see all you coming in and to listen to our speaker this morning. I'm going to welcome you first in my indigenous language, Laura Tohi, and Ishyatsena Habilinishle, Todajitni Bashashin, Johna Etwaslana Dasha Doma E Deshkiji Dashanala, Akut O E Asanishle, Ahyahat Arnold Sonhano Kaidi AWP conference Holyahigi. I am Laura Tohi, Sleepy Rock People Clan, born for the Bitterwater Clan, and my maternal grandfather clan are the Sun Clan people. My paternal grandfather clan are the Coyote Pass people. And I just welcome you in my native language to this year's AWP. Thank you everyone for coming out here on a Saturday morning and attending the last day of our conference. I am also on the board of directors for the AWP. The lecture you are about to hear will be given by Jake Skeets, author of Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouth Full of Flowers, winner of the National Poetry Series, American Book Award, Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and the Whitting Award. His work appears widely in journals and magazines such as Poetry, the New York Times Magazine, and the Paris Review. Skeets is from the Navajo Nation and teaches at the University of Oklahoma. This event is part of the newly launched AWP Tribal Colleges and Universities Fellowship Program, which is funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the for the Arts. This program provides space for Indigenous American creative writers at AWP by awarding fellowships to faculty and students from tribal colleges and tribal lands. Jake Skeets has joined this initiative as the program's inaugural and creative advisor, where he will lead this year's cohort in collaboration and conversation about creative writing in tribal communities. Other honors of Jake include an NEA grant for the Arts Project, a Mellon Projecting All Voices Fellowship, and the 23-24 Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. He is from the Navajo Nation. AWP can continue to grant fellowships and provide this unique opportunity to creative writers from tribal colleges and tribal lands with the help of supporters like everyone in attendance today. If so inclined, you can donate to the fellowship program at any time by visiting the TCU Fellowship Program page on AWP's website. The term Native American Renaissance has long been used to describe the surge of Native literary production in the 1960s and 70s. However, this label risks implying that Native literature lacked sophistication or vitality prior to this moment. Drawing from Diné poetics and cultural frameworks, Emergence and Becoming, Framing Native Poetics Beyond the Native Renaissance will examine how these ideas illuminate the continuity and innovation of Native storytelling traditions, offering a more expansive understanding of Native literature's past, present, and future. I'd like to remind everyone that a book signing by Jake Skeets will take place immediately after the event in the West Lobby. Books will also be available for purchase. And after the lecture, you can go out through the glass doors and take a left, and that's where you'll find the book signing table. So I now welcome Jake Skeets to the podium. Thank you.
Just a little bit taller than Laura. I have a lecture prepared, but I think I just want to talk briefly, a little off the cuff, I guess. I've just been so blown away by the native writers and authors present at this conference. I've had the privilege of attending a few events, and I've just been over and over overjoyed, and I'm learning so much every time I attend the conference, more and more, year after year. And I'm just so grateful, and I'm actually quite honored to sort of be invited to do this talk this morning. And yeah, I just wanted to say that. And also, I just want to also just honor the long list of Native writers and authors and poets who have come before me from the 1960s and even way before that. And I hope that my discussion and remarks this morning are trying to reach back into the past as far as I can as a way of illuminating a brighter future. That being said, please allow me to introduce myself in Diné, or Diné Bazad. Yad A, She Matthew Jake Skeets Yinin She. Ado Jake Skeets Dashajine. Sinajini Nishle, Twobaha Bashichin. Do Tachini Dashache, do Tworik Oje and Dashanella. Not Najoje de Kehashte, do Ad Halge Holtkel, Bikeyate Nasha. Shema a Dorinda Skeets will ye. Ado Shija a Douglas Skeets will ye. Akut ego Dene Nishlin. Yat a. Oh, Yat A. This is how I introduce myself in Diné. It translates to, hello, my name is Matthew Jake Skeets, but you can call me Jake. I am of the black-streaked wood people, born for the Water's Edge people clan. My maternal grandfather is of the red running into water people clan, and my paternal grandfather is of the saltwater people clan. My mother is Dorinda Skeets, and my father is Douglas Skeets, and I've always said my successes are always theirs first before it is mine. And this is what makes me Diné. It's how I exist as a Navajo person. So thank you for letting me introduce myself in Diné. Ado halane shike shidene do shitra asinko yad a. And I say thank you to the organizers, to Laura Tohi, to AWP, and of course to all of you dear poets and dear writers for being here this morning. Ahalane. Shike means my relatives. So anyone in this room who shares a clan with me, Sinajini, Tkabaha, Tkachitni, Do Tworik Oje, I welcome you in kinship. Shidene means my people. Those of you who are native, indigenous, queer identifying from rural places, or really into ketchup as a condiment, you are my people, and I welcome you. And shitra asinko yat a. What that means is I'm shaking the hand of everyone in this room from wall to wall, and I welcome you. And I end the introduction with Ya'at'e again, which is this way of saying this is good, this is the way it's meant to be. And I feel like I've always wanted to do this kind of introduction because back home we have a title called Miss Navajo Nation, and they're able to eloquently say their introductions, and I've always just been so jealous that I haven't been given the platform to do an introduction myself. So I'm gonna do it one more time, all in Diné. So Ya'at'e abine, ahalana shik'e sh'dine do sh'tka asilko Ya'at'e she'e Matthew Jake Skeets and she ako and de Jake Skeets da sh'jine sinajini nishle tkobahan bashish chin tkashini da sh'che do twodik ojen da sh'nella she'e Dorinda Skeets will yeah ado sh'ja'ad Douglas Skeets will yeah ako t'e dine nishle ako t'ego. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me do that. Shanella Etzan, Lucy, the poet Lucy Tapahanso, my grandmother through clan, often talks about how Ya'at'e can mean hello. But it can also be translated as from the ground beneath us to the sky above in this space, in this room. Everything is as it should be, and it is good. It is an acknowledgement of place, an acknowledgement of relationality, of kinship, of continuity. It is an acknowledgement of the blessings required for us to gather today in this room, in this town, in this region. So one more time, Ya'at'e. Good morning. And when you wake up tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, after this long week, when you wake up for your flights back home, don't wake up with bad feelings. Instead, wake up and say to yourself, Ya'at'e. Ya'at'e abine, o Ya'at'e. And before I begin my talk this morning, I also want to take a moment to recognize some of the programs and organizations that are actively shaping the current landscape of Native literature. Communities that are building, supporting, and sustaining Indigenous writers across generations. As Laura mentioned, I'm here today as the creative advisor for the inaugural cohort of the AWP Tribal College and University Fellowship. Over the past few days, I've had the honor of spending time with both the student and faculty fellows, listening, sharing, and learning alongside them. I shared these remarks already with the cohort earlier this week, but I also want to share them again here. The AWP TCU Fellowship Program is in its first year, but what it represents stretches far back. Our tribal colleges and universities have been creating space for Indigenous thought and creativity for decades. Our communities have been telling stories, poems, songs, histories, visions, jokes, since long before anything called a writing program existed. This fellowship isn't about giving a voice to the voiceless. It is about creating support, visibility, and space for voices that have always been here, that have always mattered. I've had the privilege of getting to know the student and faculty fellows, and I can tell you that these writers are already doing incredible things. They're drawing from land, from family, from places, from memories, from dreaming. Their writing is a reminder that Native literature isn't just something to be preserved or archived. It's alive. It's a current event. It's happening now, and it's shaping the future of literature more broadly. I want to thank AWP for putting real energy behind this program, and especially the folks who helped shape its vision and bring it to life. I want to thank the writers who applied, who showed up, who shared their work and their time and their stories. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here on Saturday morning, for reading Indigenous writers, for supporting Native literature in whatever way you do. Additionally, I serve as a board member for Indigenous Nations Poets, or INAPO, an organization that has been making powerful moves in the larger literary space. Founded in 2020 by poet and scholar Kimberly Blazer, INAPO is a national Indigenous poetry community committed to mentoring emerging writers, nurturing Indigenous poetic practices, and raising the visibility of Native poets, past, present, and future. INAPO recognizes that poetry is not just about art, it's about sovereignty. It's a tool for sustaining tribal nations, Native languages, and Indigenous knowledge systems. In a few short years, the organization has brought together some of the most talented Native poets working today, offering support and mentorship toward the publication of their first and second books. Fellows have gone on to be recognized by the National Poetry Series and even the National Book Awards and other major platforms. But more importantly, they are publishing work that is visionary, complex, and deeply rooted in their communities. I also want to acknowledge the All Diné March issue of Poetry Magazine, guest edited by Esther Boleyn. The issue features a vibrant constellation of Diné voices and comes on the heels of the Diné Reader, a first-of-its-kind anthology of Diné literature that centers our storytelling across genre and generation. This, I believe, continues the work set forth by Joy Harjo through her groundbreaking anthologies, Living Nations, Living Words, and When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. Books that gathered Native writers across time, space, language, and landscape during Joy Harjo's historic tenure as U.S. Poet Laureate. Of course, there are other landmark collections recently I want to mention that help illuminate the trajectory that I feel we are on. Shapes of Native Nonfiction, New Poets of Native Nations, and Native Voices, Indigenous American Poetry, Craft, and Conversations. Each one a chorus, a community, a text of relation. These books do not mark isolated moments of arrival. They loop into one another. They speak to each other. They are part of a continuous act of emergence, each one offering another path forward, another form of gathering. And it's not just the books themselves, it's the labor behind them. Native writers are not only writing poems, they are building presses, editing anthologies, running collectives, mentoring new generations, creating digital archives, and building our own infrastructures of care. These two are acts of poetics. These two can be sacred texts. And in the spirit of gathering and an infrastructure of care, I also want to begin this morning by recognizing that we are gathering in a time of crisis. We are gathering to talk about the literature of Indigenous peoples in the United States, peoples who have endured decades of genocide and colonial aggression. And while we gather, the Palestinian people continue to be brutalized by the decades-long American-funded genocide and colonial violence of Israeli apartheid. I want to stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine, as well as with victims of genocide in Sudan and Congo. I also honor the indigenous peoples whose ancestral homelands holds this very conference, the Tonga, the Tataviam, Serrano, Keech, and Chumash peoples. This lecture discusses technologies of power, among them the technology of state-sanctioned violence and erasure, still being enacted upon Black and brown communities, trans and queer communities, gender nonconforming and non-binary people, and indigenous peoples across the globe. These struggles are not isolated, they are entangled. And this lecture is one small part of our collective resistance that has been ongoing for generations and will continue for as long as we are here, and we are still here. T'ade ko haniglo, we are still here. Because our purpose is this, to fight in the name of those we love. I also want to make some points of clarity. This morning, in this talk, I used terms indigenous, native, Native American, American Indian interchangeably, but my reference is always Native people within the United States. However, I am aware and am actually excited about the fact that there can be overlaps and necessary interventions when we consider indigeneity across the world. For my own tribal identities, I use Diné, not to be confused with Diné, our relatives from up north, and I also use Navajo interchangeably. When I introduced myself with my clans earlier, I began with my mother's clan, Sinajine. Diné have always lived within a matriarchal society. We inherit our first clan through our mothers. I can trace my first clan, Sinajine, through generations. It has been translated in many ways, Black streaked wood people or Black streak wood people. There are many origin stories for this clan. One is that they were gatherers, often seen moving through the trees, only the dark streaks of their hair visible among the branches, hence Black streaked wood people. Another story was told to me by Dr. Herman Cody, a Diné Hatkatli, a Navajo language activist and longtime educator. I had been invited to perform poetry at an event hosted by the Navajo Nation Office of President and Vice President. Dr. Cody was the keynote speaker. After I read, he took the stage and shared an anecdote. He said he heard that the Sinajini were scouts and leaders. They would walk miles ahead of the group to search for danger. You could only make out their silhouettes on the horizon, streaking ahead. And that, he said, is why the clan could also be translated as those who walk ahead. He then said to me, being a poet makes sense because most Sinajini people were artists, thinkers, poets, and singers. They were the ones asked to deliver warning, to see ahead, to offer back to the people a story of what's to come. Dr. Cody then introduced himself, and he introduced himself with his first clan, Sinajini. And he said to me, it makes sense you come from this clan. The job of the poet is to walk ahead, to look far into the future, to observe and contextualize, and to return to the people with a vision. So here we are, the work of the writer, the poet, is to walk ahead of the people, to be in constant emergence, to move forward, and in a way move in spirals, in returns, in echoes. Our job is to peer ahead and to give back what we've seen, to offer story, to make meaning, to remind us of who we are and what might still become, to be emerging and becoming. And this is where I locate a native poetics, not as a fixed style or aesthetic, not as a checklist of themes or forms, but as a living, breathing process of emergence. Native poetics is not bound by genre, it is all genre, among and between all genres and beyond genre itself. It is rooted in relationship, in voice, in movement, in time. It is about continuity, survival, and imagination made language. It is refusal and revision. It is continuation. Native poetics is not simply about craft, and it insists on its own terms. Genre, like form, is not neutral. These are often colonial constructs, imported to organize, contain, and categorize art in ways that have served institutions and gatekeeping rather than people and place. To many indigenous communities, stories don't separate themselves into poetry or prose. There is no strict line between myth and memory, prayer and performance, dream and document. These divisions are artificial, introduced through colonial education systems that demand taxonomy, definition, a hard border between categories. A native poetics slips across these borders and has always done so. And let's remember that the word genre shares etymological roots with the word gender. Both trace back to the Latin genus, meaning kind or type. These are systems of classification that have been used to sort and rank bodies and expressions. Genre becomes a way to discipline literature. Gender becomes a way to discipline the body. Both have histories of violence, both serve empire when unexamined, and both are being dismantled by those of us who understand that creativity and identity are not fixed, they are emergent. So native poetics becomes a practice of writing that cannot and should not be pinned down. It is both text and textile, it is form and transform, it is lyric, image, theory, wail, silence, dance, translation, letter, archive, breath. It is located in the kitchen and in the canyon. It's what we pass between each other in story. In saliva, in blood, it holds past, present, and future all at once, sometimes in a single line. It is the voice of the land and the sound of what's been taken. It is ceremony. It is warning. It is joy. And to write as a native person, then, is not just to write about being native. It is to write from a place of emergence, from a process of becoming. It is to write with an awareness that the work we do with language must refuse the trap of categorization, must resist being flattened into digestible pieces for the colonial archive. Our poetics are not a renaissance. They are not a trend. They are an act of walking ahead. And I feel like I didn't always know I was walking ahead, or even walking at all, or even writing at that. Like many of us in this room, I started writing with fragments, sentences scribbled in the margins of notebooks, little lines that didn't yet know where they were going. In high school, I won a small poetry contest hosted by the Gallup Public Library, where I'm from. As an award, I received the complete Emily Dickinson. In class, I didn't pass notes, I wrote poems. trying to mimic Dickinson's strange, powerful devotion to the line, to the syllable. Her commitment to language is something that I've always been trying to emerge into. I always knew I wanted to be a poet because I needed language. I had no first language. It was robbed of me. I needed somewhere to put everything I was feeling and everything I had seen. My becoming a writer wasn't marked by a single moment. It was a slow unfolding, a kind of forever arriving. Through writing, I learned that poems could hold grief, but they could also hold joy. That they could contain contradiction, that they could refuse to explain themselves. Becoming a writer meant emerging again and again from assumptions, both mine and others. It meant allowing myself to be shaped by words as much as by my clans, by the land, by the language of my people. It meant trusting that poetry didn't have to solve everything. It only had to reach. And that reach became the kind of compass, helping me navigate the path toward making writing a life. I first encountered a Native American literature in my junior year of high school. I switched schools and attended Window Rock High School, located in Window Rock, Arizona, the capital of the Navajo Nation. And I remember my academic advisor on the first day of school looking at my math test scores and encouraging me to study within the school's vocational track, which would set me up for a job in refrigeration repair once I graduated high school. Instead, I insisted on an academic one because my scores in English should outweigh my scores in math. And I requested an advanced placement English class, but at the time, Window Rock High School didn't offer them. Instead, a scrappy college prep English class was gathered, and my teacher, Ms. Chi, as I remember, handed out a packet of scanned poems by Native American authors: Joy Harjo, Lucy Tapahanso, Laura Tohi, Gordon Henry, James Welch, and I finally found what I had been reaching for. After high school, I attended the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as a creative writing major, where I studied with Lucy Tapahanso herself. Later, I pursued my MFA at the Institute of American Indian Arts through the low residency writing program. There, I worked one-on-one with Native poets across 4 semesters: Sherwin Bitsui, Santi Fraser, and Joan Kane, and I learned from the many guest writers and students who traveled the campus during the summer and winter residencies. And of course, I share all of this not because I'm really sharing this because I'm trying to take advantage of this larger platform to kind of reintroduce myself, but because this journey helped shape how I think about Native poetics and how I engage with major literary movements within Native literature itself. The guidance I received from these poets helped me begin a deeper interrogation, an interrogation of the term Native American literature itself and its relationship to indigenous self-determination and sovereignty with these movements for liberation. My writing, like my becoming, is part of that larger collective motion. I became interested in this topic because Indigenous literature is inherently queer. Indigenous literature is queer because Indigenous existence is queer. Our histories are not just measured by years, but by our bodies. Time is not only marked, it is sensed. Time is carried, time is felt, and by extension, our stories are felt. You don't just read a Native poem, you feel it. Like the sudden breeze from the west that brings the scent of rain and the weight of a coming storm. And so, when you hear a term like Native American Renaissance, we must ask, what kind of time does this language presume? What kind of history does it enact? Because while the term gave visibility to a wave of Native writers in the 60s and 70s, it also imposed a Western framework, one built on linearity, on rupture and rebirth, on progress as a march forward. Renaissance, as a word, implies a return to greatness, a reawakening after something lost. But Native poetics has never been lost, it was targeted. However, our stories never stopped, which is the queerness embedded in Native storytelling. We do not need to be reborn, we were always becoming in the first place. Coined by Kenneth Leakin in 1985, the term Native American Renaissance was effective in drawing national attention to the increased visibility of Native writers and their work. It brought into focus authors like Inscott Mamade, Leslie Marmon Silko, and James Welch, and has since been used to denote a so-called first wave of Native literary production that gained prominence again in the 60s and 70s. Within this framework, we also recognize the rise of Vine Deloria, Gerald Visner, Simon Ortiz, Louise Erdrich, and Joy Harjo, authors whose work continues to shape how we think about Native writing in the so-called United States. But today, I want to question the validity of the word Renaissance as a framework for Native literary production. But I want to make it clear that this questioning isn't about detracting from the significance or success of those writers. Their contributions are essential. I do believe there's merit in honoring the 60s and 70s as a moment of increased Native thought and creative expression. After all, our tribal colleges and universities began in the 60s and 70s. However, as a poet, I'm particularly drawn to the meaning, weight, and shape of a word. And the word Renaissance, with all its connotations and historical baggage, asks for interrogation, especially when placed alongside the word Enlightenment. Both are part of a larger Eurocentric lexicon that seeks to chart time and culture as linear progressions, as a forward motion. But indigenous communities here and across the globe don't operate in this kind of physics. Time for us is not linear. It is cyclical. It is repetitive. And it is centered on return and renewal. It is focused on an everlasting process of becoming whole. Meanwhile, the Western project of progress requires an endpoint, a destination, a settling in. It asks that a destiny be manifested and be made real by any means necessary. Within this logic, those outside its path are rendered counter, a hindrance, an obstacle, and so they are made vulnerable to the machinations of empire. The term Renaissance presumes a kind of dormancy or silence before the 1960s, as if Native literature, art, and culture was non-existent and was only awakened by proximity to American audience and readership. But of course, this isn't true. The technologies of power, particularly erasure, are subtle and deeply ingrained. And it's my belief that framing Native literary expression as a quote-unquote Renaissance erases the sophistication and dynamism of Native art before the 1960s, before contact, and before colonization. This framework privileges a Western model of history, a model that moves from primitive to modern, that relies on rupture and rebirth, rather than continuity and survival. Renaissance, after all, means rebirth, and it is often aligned with transitions into modernity. But I ask, who were the ones dying? But what if we reject the notion that Native literature needed to be reborn in the first place? What if we understood Native storytelling as already alive, already thriving, already complex before it entered the purview of Western institutions? Native storytelling has always been a dynamic event. It has always been an evolving practice. Year after year, at this very conference where we gather today, it shows how Native writers are continuing to innovate not just the craft of writing, but the craft of living in the world today. Responding to climate change, political crises, continued colonial violence, technological expansion, and the very waypoints of apocalypse. And it is precisely the literature of people and peoples who have already lived through apocalypse that can help light the way forward. It's important to name the ways the label Native American Renaissance is wrapped up in capitalist structures. It elevates a few voices for consumption while marginalizing many others. As Native writers continue to shift what writing can be and what writing can do, the call for categorization becomes louder, because things targeted for consumption require a name. And while naming can often be a tool of reclamation, it is so often a tool of colonization, a way for power to digest and repackage something for mass appeal. Publishing and academia play key roles in shaping these perceptions. The literary market creates cycles of visibility and rediscovery. Suddenly, several Native authors will appear in the spotlight, quote unquote, reinventing Native writing, quote unquote, innovating its form. But they, the Native authors themselves, never use this kind of language. I've always seen Native writers approach their lineage, their literary ancestries with intention and scrutiny. Western institutions are largely the cause of this vocabulary because it's trying to paint a picture of progressive motion for the American Indian. After the spike is over, silence again, at least until the next quote-unquote wave. This is not how Native literature functions. This is not how our stories work. And here I want to speak plainly, and as plainly as I can. The Academy, too, is often complicit in flattening Native literatures. Institutions of higher education, creative writing programs, English departments, literary journals are frequently invested in canon making, in standardization, in gatekeeping what counts as craft or innovation. These structures often demand Native literature and, by extension, Native liberation conform to colonial ideas of genre, structure, or theme. And when it doesn't, it risks being dismissed as quote-unquote personal, political, or insufficiently literary. But Native poetics does not need to perform literature to be literature. We have always known that our stories hold theory, prayer, argument, and aesthetic all at once. I wanted to provide examples from other Native writers, but I'm also aware that this reframing and unsettling of Renaissance is a subjective work, to be done by Native writers and authors at their own pace and within their own vocabularies. So I want to talk about the way I approach Native writing and literature as an act of emerging, of becoming. In my first book, Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, I was very aware of how readers might engage with my poems. especially through the lens of trauma. The book is often read as a meditation on violence, on queerness, on survival. And in many ways, it is. But for me, it is also a reclamation, a joyful reclamation. On the cover is a portrait of my uncle Benson James, taken in 1979 by Richard Avedon during his In the American West project. The portrait was taken in Gallup, New Mexico. A year later, in 1980, my uncle was murdered, one story in a long history of missing and murdered indigenous people in border towns across the country. Avedon, unaware of this, later sent my family a signed copy of his book. That portrait, my uncle's image, became central to my writing. Gallup became the backdrop. I wrote into the white space of those poems, knowing that readers would bring their own assumptions. I used those assumptions, I circumvented them, affirmed them, redirected them. This too is a technique I learned by studying the poets of the Renaissance, poets who understood the presence of what I've come to call a colonial veil. This veil is something non-native readers often bring with them, despite the best of intentions. It filters how they engage with native work. It demands certain narratives, ones that can be tolerated, ones that can be commodified. It seeks stories of trauma, tragedy, and survival, often ignoring stories of joy, futurity, and everyday beauty. And it runs the risk of shaping native storytelling into something fashionable, something that fits nearly into non-native expectations. That veil can flatten our stories into stereotypes. It can limit the breadth and depth of native literary production. Colonial readerships often freeze us in the past. But we are not fixed to the past, and our literature is not a relic. Native writing is something ongoing, something living, something deeply rooted in our lands, our bodies, our ways of knowing time and space. In Diné Poetics, for instance, we do not emphasize rupture. We emphasize continuity. Our creation stories remind us that we move through many worlds. Our worlds have ended. We have endured apocalypse, and we have continued. The circle doesn't close, it opens. The word ya'at'e is a good example of this. Our stories are migratory, our weavings nonlinear. We emerge again and again and again and always and everlasting. We are always on the verge of becoming. This is why fluidity, adaptation, and refusal are central to native storytelling. Our stories don't fit into boxes. They defy imposed categories. The Renaissance framework insists that rebirth is required for new movement to begin in the first place. But we know that native creativity never stops moving. What's happening now is not rebirth. It's reassertion. It's re-emergence. It's re-becoming. My second poetry collection, Horses, borrows the title from 4 deeply formative sources. The book Blue Horses for Navajo Women by Nia Francisco. The book Blue Horses Rush In by Lucy Tapahanso. The book She Had Some Horses by Joy Harjo. And of course, Patti Smith's album Horses. These works shaped the cultural and poetic imagination of horses long before my book even existed. I wanted horses to live inside that chorus, not to stand apart, but to honor the lineage I'm writing within. I want to place my book beside these earlier works to say this too is part of that ongoing conversation and continuation, a threading. The book itself begins with a traumatic event involving horses, like the opening of my first book, but this time, the presence of that trauma is not just rupture. The title Horses and the lineage it draws from is my way of reclaiming joy, of honoring time. It's a gesture toward relationality, toward an intertextual kinship. I set out to write about the end of the world, but I ended up writing about the possibilities of emerging into a new one. In Eyes Bottled Dark, I set out to write a book about life in a border town, but I ended up with a book about desire, longing, and a proximity to land that we all carry within us. My work has always been referential, drawing from writers who have come before me. I want it to be read as a return to what Native literature has already known, that joy and pain exist alongside one another, and that our stories hold both. My novel, Dawn House, emerges from a similar place of conversation and response. I don't have to tell you that my title, Dawn House, is directly linked to N. Scott Momady's House Made of Dawn, a pivotal work in Native literature and a cornerstone of what's often been referred to again as the Native American Renaissance. The phrase, house made of dawn itself, is borrowed from Diné songs and prayers. I carry that borrowing with care as I return it back to a Diné context. I see Dawn House not as a retelling or reinvention of Momady's novel, but as a reflection in his light. A house that stands nearby, made of the same sky, the same wind, but built in another moment, with another voice. Both of these projects, Horses and Dawn House, continue my commitment to writing as emergence, to writing as conversation. They are not departures from what came before. They are arrivals that carry others with them. And this week, I visited with Indigenous writers attending this conference, and I've read new books by Native writers and poets, and I can report back that they are all resisting the limitations imposed by publishers, by markets, by canons, by Western institutions, by colonialism. They are building their own forms, their own paths, their own vocabularies of becoming. So, what do we do with this word, Renaissance? What do we do with the term Native American Renaissance? I think we can start by simply acknowledging it and honoring the writers who flourished under that banner. And as we continue to move into the possibilities of the future, I feel like in this way, Indigenous literature is responsible for being a kind of futurist project. Indigenous literature is speculative because, in a way, indigeneity is also speculative. When time is robbed of us, we enter with a different kind of temporal mode. These practices, these stories require a time scale that is not linear, that is not Western, that does not require death and rebirth to exist. Emergence is one way we framed our creation, becoming is another. And if I had to choose a new term to describe Native literary expression beyond the Native American Renaissance, it would be this: an emergent literature, a literature of becoming. In this framework, new writers, quote unquote, are not replacing older, quote unquote, ones. They are joining them, walking together into the future. Native literature is not a cycle of rediscovery, it is a continuum, to borrow a term from Dr. Manny Loli. I want to offer this, especially to those of you who are non-native writers, editors, educators, readers, or organizers in this room. You are not outside this conversation. In fact, you are central to it. You are part of the conditions under which Native literature is read, taught, published, received, reviewed, and remembered. And so I encourage you to ask, what doors are you opening, and for whom? What syllabi are you curating? What voices are you inviting into your classrooms, your reading series, your reading lists? Whose poetics are you making room for, and on what terms? Native literature is not an elective. It is not a diversity checkbox. It is not a trend. It is not a genre. It is literature. It is philosophy. It is theory. It is breath and story work, and it deserves to be studied, taught, and celebrated as such. Native literature is a long-breathing document and story told in many voices, through various bodies, across many lands, always moving toward what comes next, emerging, becoming. And because I'm a poet, I do want to end with a poem of mine. This poem is from my new collection of poems, again titled Horses. And the poem is called Searching for Truth in the Morning. In the east, a cornfield wrinkles a quiet snow, passing ice and hail silk, cattle whites. Beyond the sunflower-threaded fence, a hilltop of morning. Dews the burst line of pinon and big sage. In the cloud place, a sky just opened in low blue, never just blue. Drawn out by cicada and bromharp and hummingbird. The only truth around here is dark moss, damp warm, beneath squash bugs, holding light on their backs. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you so much for listening. I'm truly honored to be here. Thank you so much. I ended a bit early, but that's okay. Again, time is not linear. Thank you so much for being here.